I could start with the joke and say I am a rubbish historian, nothing like my colleague Olivia, who started this series off really well last month with a really thought-provoking talk about prisons. If I can be anywhere near as thought-provoking as Olivia was, I'll have done my job. Now, there's another reason why I wanted to talk about bins in Leeds, and it's because our city is home to a very famous bin. Some of you, I'm sure, will recognise this picture. I'm a little bit too young for Dusty Bin, only just, but I was going to try to do the 3, 2, 1, is that right? 3, 2, 1 was a television programme in the 1980s. It was a sort of 3-part quiz and variety show. It was hosted by a comedian called Ted Rogers. It started in 1978 and ran through till the end of the 1980s. And actually, it was one of the most popular, most watched television programmes in Britain during that period. It was made by Yorkshire TV here in Leeds on Kirkstall Road. And actually, Dusty Bin, pictures here, the mascot, Dusty still lives on Kirkstall Road. So you can go to the YTV studios and you can see this original bin. The bin was made by a chap in Rodley. And again, if any of you have ever been out through Rodley, you may have seen a really intriguing pub which has Dusty Bin on a sign in the garden. So there's this local connection there. But I think Dusty Bin's important, not just because of that kind of cultural significance, but because, I mean, this was such a recognisable character that you could dress it up in a hat, big nose, shoes, bow tie. You still know what it is. It's a dustbin. And I think there is something about that salience, which is important. So in the late 1970s, this is what we thought of when we thought of bins. Dusty's not one of my 5 bins, but we will come back to Dusty at the end. And the movable metal bin, of which Dusty is an example, is definitely one of the bins I'm going to be talking about. There is nothing, though, inevitable about the fact that we associate dustbins with receptacles like this. And to start, I want to actually go right back about 200 years to the birth of Leeds as the town that we know it today. And these are 2 maps that I use in my teaching on a first year module called Society and Culture. They actually both come from the Thoresby Society collection. Some of you may well be familiar with them. The map which is on your left, which is the eldest, this is called A Plan of Leeds, was published by a man called Thomas Jeffreys in 1771. And what you can really see here, and if you squint hard enough, is you can see Briggate. So this is Briggate. There's a little bit of a built-up area around it. This is the parish church, and here's the River Aire coming in. This very small urban settlement is surrounded by fields. So this is still effectively a kind of rural environment. And it shows Briggate, really, this would have been a bustling place, but it would have been a relatively small place. We fast forward 100 years to the map on the right-hand side, which is dated from 1866. So it's almost exactly 95 years later. This is a Bartholomew map, and it shows a thriving industrial town. You may be able to make out a canal as well as the river. If you look hard enough, you can see railway lines, not just 1, but 2 coming in, a new central station, which allows that east-west connection. And we can also see how the historic heart of Leeds has expanded outwards. So we've got new suburbs, we've got new terraces, we've got new industrial buildings. Just to give you a sense of scale, that little square is the first map. So what was then rural is now at the heart of this growing, thriving industrial town. And the population of Leeds had grown from roughly 20,000 to almost 250,000 people during this period. So this is a massive rate of change within just 3 generations. And an obvious question is, well, how did they cope? How did they get goods in? But then also, what did they do with the waste that was being produced? And the answer is something like this. This is the reality. This is Black Swan Yard. It's off North Street. Some of you may be familiar with the old red bus station. It was for a long time bus station. It's now a very cool vegan restaurant. This is the site of the old red bus station. It's something that was called the Black Swan Yard, just off North Street. And this is the yard as it awaited demolition around the turn of the 20th century. And the rapid growth of places like this around that older 18th century heart of Leeds was a cause of real concern to the authorities. And it was for this reason that in 1824, Leeds's leaders passed something called an Improvement Act, which included the provision for street cleansing, which was then known as scavenging. So here's the first weird word we're going to learn today. Scavenging was street cleansing for most of the 18th and 19th century. There was, however, no provision for waste collection in this Improvement Act. Instead, most rubbish would have been burned by the people that lived in places like this, and the ashes would have been thrown into large open containers called ash pits. And ash pits were also a receptacle for things like human waste, for rotten food, pretty much anything that you wanted to get rid of. These pits would periodically be emptied by scavengers who would use what they could in whatever means they could. So the ashes might be used in brick making or as a soil fertilizer. If there's anything of value in there, that's going to get sold on. So this is a type of recycling, but it's one which is very dirty, very grimy. And it was not something for polite Victorian conversation. It was also something which very quickly became associated with ill health. And the 1824 Improvement Act only allowed for the removal of household waste in exceptional circumstances, and when something was deemed to be a nuisance. And here's another of those weird words, nuisances. Often this meant something that was rotting, something that was going to cause ill health. And in the cholera epidemic that swept through Leeds in 1832, household refuse was identified as a nuisance, something that was contributing to the spread. And apparently 75 cartloads of soil, so think ashes, human waste, etc., 75 cartloads taken out of a yard like this, the boot and shoe yard, which is now near the Victoria Quarter. And this was a job that was done by paupers. So paupers from the Leeds workhouse, which actually, incidentally, was just around the corner from this yard. It was their responsibility to take this stuff away. That boot and shoe yard, where 75 cartloads of the stuff were removed during the cholera epidemic, that wasn't cleaned again for 7 years. So this is something which was, episodic at best. And for a Leeds surgeon called Robert Baker, we just go on to the next slide, he made a very clear connection between this sort of practice and the spread of cholera and other communicable diseases. Now, we've actually got some primary sources connected to this at the back. There's 2 wonderful tables which the librarians have put out. On that side of the room, there's all of the old 19th century sources. On the left-hand side of the room, some 1990s material. So before you leave today, do have a look, because there's some really fantastic material from the library's collection. But this is a map which I think is just brilliant. This is one of the first attempts to do what we might now call contact tracing. So this is to work out how a disease spreads by plotting the spread of that disease through a population. And in 1832, Robert Baker started to do this for cholera victims because he attended some of the first. He realised this was a new disease and he wanted to try and understand it. So each of the households that succumbed to cholera in Leeds was plotted on this map. And what Baker did, he succumbed to cholera himself, actually. He got better, but he did get very poorly, but he managed to map all 700 victims. And what he found is that the vast majority of cases were clustering in the east of the city, so towards the right-hand side of this map. And they were in areas which he deemed to be fairly unhygienic. So the 2 things that are going on with this map, if you look hard enough, there's some little blue dots, those are the cases. And then there's also brown shading. That means streets where there's no paving, there's no regular refuse collection, there's no sewerage. Most of it's in the east of the city, or there's a little bit over here to the west as well. And he saw that there was this very clear correlation between ill health and poor sanitation. Now, Baker didn't make the connection. He didn't invent sort of bacteriology. He's not deemed to be the sort of the person that came up with these ideas around microbes. That's another doctor, John Snow, who was working in the 1850 cholera epidemic in London. But Baker was so close. And what he did do very clearly is he took this data and he used it for political ends. He basically petitioned the Board of Health, the medical board here in Leeds, to actually improve some of this sanitation and to try and do something to tackle disease. So here's what he told the Leeds Board of Health. He said, "I do not wish to dwell on details so repugnant and disgusting, but I am justified in asserting that I never but once met with a town where in certain parts so large a quantity of offensive matter was allowed to accumulate in the streets, as I've done in Leeds. And Baker saw this very much, this was about almost a social problem. There were some parts of the city or the town where waste was being collected. In those richer districts to the west of the city, of the town centre, actually, it made sense if you're a scavenger to go there because people are throwing away things which you can use. In the east of the town, where nothing but human waste and ashes are getting thrown out, you just leave it for 7 years and people get ill. So Baker made this connection. He petitioned the town's authorities to do well. And I think this quote is also important because it shows just how closely related bodily waste and household waste were in this sort of mid-19th century moment. And Baker's report has two impacts. One of them is at a local level and one of them is at a national level. Here in Leeds, Baker's findings lead to a new Improvement Act, this one dated 1842, which was one of the most progressive ever obtained by a local authority, and saw the recently formed town council take responsibility for the removal of all forms of waste, whether that be sewerage or whether that be household waste. And this process was contracted out to willing scavengers. So you're no longer using paupers and forcing them to do it. Instead, you're paying people to do this process. And this photograph, which is from a lot later in the 19th century, is evidence of the process. The chap in the bowler hat is a member of Leeds Municipal Engineers Department, and he's inspecting a yard between Mabgate and Quarry Hill. And the photograph also shows my second bin. So if the ash pit was number one, the second, the successor to it, is the midden or the middenstad, and it's the strange little square window in the middle. What this effectively is a covered ash pit. So you're still just throwing everything into one place, but it's now got a roof on it. So when it rains, it's not going to go everywhere. It's contained. Your problem is contained. It's not going to smell as much. And these bins, these middens, would have been periodically emptied by council-approved scavengers who would have climbed in through the window and then hauled out buckets of waste. And what this photograph, I think, also shows is you're getting the increasing separation of bodily refuse from household refuse, because next to the middenstad is a door, which is a water closet. So this is the beginning of plumbing, sanitation, water closets, and an effective sewerage system. So it's the same problem, but it's being dealt with now in two slightly different ways. And middens like the one in the photo, they were commonly built next to water closets, and they actually did last almost as long as those outdoor loos. So there were still plenty of photographs of these in situ and being used into the early 20th century, and many of them were retained kind of architecturally until the 1950s and 1960s. Now, I mentioned that there was also a national impact of Baker's report, and that is that at a national level, Baker's evidence fed into a broader inquiry into public health, which was led by the leading Victorian reformer, Edwin Chadwick. And that work eventually led to two public health acts, the 1848 and 1875 Public Health Acts, which was national government for the first time legislating for public health. And these acts are now best remembered for bringing, allowing towns to bring clean water in, for sewerage systems, those sorts of things. But household refuse was very much a part of them. In fact, middens and other refuse containers, although they've been written out of our understanding of Victorian history, they were really important in leading to that increased state intervention. In fact, the 1875 Public Health Act made town councils across the country responsible for the regular collection of household waste. And this established a role which is still with us today. So the fact that it's our council that takes the bins rather than a voluntary organisation or private company, that dates back to 1875, and it's been that way ever since. So bins, or a lack of them, contributed to the shift towards a more interventionist form of government, a form of government where those in charge assumed responsibility for the health of those who they governed. And in the 1870s, there's another big change, which particularly plays out in Leeds, which is the birth of new technologies for dealing with the waste which is being collected. The 1870s see the beginnings of what we now call incineration, but at the time was called waste destruction. And while Leeds can't claim to have the world's first operational waste destructor, it did have one of the first five. So in 1876, a group of councillors from Leeds went to Manchester, which had invested in this technology. They wanted to do the same, and they brought the technology back to Leeds. And by the end of the 1890s, the city had 4 destructor plants. I've not been able to find an image of the first, but this is a beautiful postcard of Meanwood Valley. So this is Woodhouse Ridge, looking across to what is now the Meanwood Valley Urban Farm, and those houses are still there on Meanwood Road. The big chimney on the right-hand side is the local council recycling centre. So it's still a kind of waste processing site. But this was home to an incinerator from the 1870s right the way through to the 1970s when that chimney came down. And the destructor, I think, it's part of that story of councils becoming more involved, seeking solutions for these problems. But it brought with it its own problems. How did you actually collect the waste to take to one of these sites? Having somebody climb through a little window in a midden and coming out of a bucket, it's not very efficient. So instead, councils across the country increasingly turned to this. It's the movable metal dustbin. And dustbins were promoted from 1875 onwards as part of this professionalisation of waste collection. Their rise did not happen overnight, although their dominance was really assured by the 1930s, when dustbins were actually written into a revised Public Health Act. So the government said that the standard should be weekly collection from a bin like this. And the rise of dustbins led to the advent of new collection technologies, with horse-drawn vehicles increasingly replaced by those with electric or combustion engines. And again, you really have to squint or you miss it, but this advert, it says City of Leeds Corporation on the back. So this is an advert promoting, Leeds Council, one of the biggest councils in the country, is using this vehicle, so your council should too. Despite these new technologies, dust collection was still a dirty and physical act. So a dustbin like this, the lidded British Standard dustbin, it made in this case by a company in Shipley called Butterfields. This weighed around 11 kilograms when it was empty. That's 25 pounds. And almost all collection processes would involve the collector going to somebody's doorstep, picking this thing up, hoiking it over their shoulder, taking it to one of those vehicles, depositing it, and then taking it back to the curbside. So this is a very, very tiring, dirty act. There's no dustbin bags in here. This is just pure waste going into the back of one of those vehicles. But these adverts also show how refuse collection from movable metal bins was presented almost as a form of progress. So we've got a really interesting mix here between, on the one hand, modernity, this is high tech, but then there's also the real suburban imagery in the back of the second advert. So we've got leafy streets, we've got suburban semi-detached houses. This is about progress and comfort going hand in hand. This is a world away from the dirty Victorian ash pit or midden. And Leeds in the 1930s was an ambitious place. This kind of advert makes sense. The city by the 1930s had around 781,000 inhabitants, and it had expanded far beyond its 18th century core, incorporating townships like Bramley, but also new suburbs and council estates, expanding well into previously rural spaces. And this is what things look like in practice. So I've been trawling through the Leodis photo archive trying to find images of dustbins. We've got one here. This is a yard. So this is like the legacy of 18th century Leeds. This is a yard off the hedgerow. And again, we've got those bins all the way down it. We've then got dustbins outside of Terrace and Sheepscar. This road was knocked down in the 70s to make way for an industrial estate. We've got dustbins in I think this is actually, I'm going to get it wrong now. It's either Holbeck or Beeston. I'm going to go for Beeston. This is a 1939 photograph. Anderson shelters have just been delivered. And then on the right there, we've got dustbins in suburban Meanwood. This is Parkland Crescent. We've got that lovely little motor car in the garage here. This is affluence. This is a time of increased consumerism, but the dustbin is there just as it was in that little alleyway. And by the 1930s, this is a time of increased consumerism. People have got more choices in the shops. There are tinned goods, there are convenience foods, Kit Kats, fruit pastels, loads of things that we still think about today. The 1930s was actually a time of comparative consumerism, and the impact was that more waste began to be collected. So incinerators like that on Meanwood Road weren't able to cope, and instead we gave rise to things like this. The 1930s was the time where landfill came of age, and this is helped by the dustbin. Modern landfill practices were actually pioneered in Bradford. It was for many years called the Bradford system. And this was something that dates really to the decade after the First World War. Anyone who's into rugby might have been to Odsal Stadium, which is made in a former landfill. So there's some really interesting examples of landfill being used for kind of creative means. In Leeds, we weren't as scientific. We didn't do controlled tipping, we did uncontrolled tipping. And that meant sites like this on Gipton Lane in the northeast of the city. This is just really a pile of ash and other waste waiting to be kind of taken into the landscape. Tips like this worked by dumping crude refuse and incinerator ash into old quarries and pits, and there was very little environmental protection. A couple of photos that really show this. The photograph on the left, this is Buslingthorpe looking down onto Meanwood Valley, a very desolate landscape of former quarries. Mostly here, the tipping was incinerator ash. On the right-hand side, this is Wortley Beck. So Wortley Beck, this is in West Leeds. And you can just make out in the back waste that has leached out of one of those crude tips. So you've got a car tyre, some containers. There's no environmental protection here at all. These sites were basically open to the elements. And the interesting thing about all these sites is that they are, of course, still there. So just bear this picture in mind, and this is what it looks like today. This is Scott Hall Road, Potter Newton roundabout, looking left down towards Chapel Town on the left-hand side, and then the city centre over on the right. And this open space, which is a huge piece of open space, very close to the city centre, this is there because it's a former landfill and you can't build on it. And in fact, Scott Hall had been extensively quarried to build Leeds in the 19th century. And from the 1920s onwards, it was used for tipping, mostly of incinerator ash. The deepest quarry, which was estimated to have been around 30 metres deep and 200 metres wide, is now the pitch of the Leeds Caribbean Cricket Club. A club which Leeds is very proud of, because when it was founded in 1948, it became the first black-run cricket club in the UK. And in fact, a history which the library has helped celebrate through work with the Jamaica Society. And Scott Hall is far from unique. DEFRA have some brilliant maps which show historic landfills. This is your map of Leeds. Anything which has got the sort of pink cross hatching is a former landfill site. Scott Hall is just up here. And the interesting thing about this map is that it's actually quite patchy. So only part of the Scott Hall site is there because a lot of the data doesn't exist before the 1970s. So actually that map is only the tip of an iceberg. These landfills are everywhere. Another one which I really like, this is part of Leeds Beckett campus. So the sports ground near the Headingley, the kind of Headingley running track, that's built on old landfill waste because it's good for levelling ground. You just use it for whatever means you can. Now I'm just going to quickly divert back to the Caribbean Cricket Club. So I said Leeds is really proud of the Leeds Caribbean Cricket Club, founded in 1948 by 6 former service personnel. So they were all in the RAF. They'd served in Yorkshire during the war, and then they became part of the Windrush generation in the late 1940s. Now this detail is important because the fact that the cricket club is there owes its existence really to the Second World War. And so does our next dustbin, because the Second World War led to a really big change, actually, in the way that waste was dealt with. Throughout the conflict and into the late 1940s, emergency laws were used to divert recyclable material back into productive use in order to maximise shipping space and save imports, which ultimately was designed to save lives. The image on the left here is how this process was advertised to the good people of Leeds. We can see some anthropomorphic dustbins. They are labelled kitchen refuse, scrap metal, waste paper, and rubber. And then they're just sort of talking to 2 normal refuse bins, trying to convince them to join the war effort. And this is an appeal to householders. This was dropped off in, I think, most people's letterboxes in July 1940 by the council. And it promises, after a bit of poetry, which is very 1940s, it promises that the council will come and collect your waste if you keep it separated. And we can see how that links into a sort of national campaign. So the photograph here, taken by the Wartime Ministry of Information, this is all about encouraging people to start separating their waste. And we've got to remember the 1930s, this was a time where the dustbin was king. People were used to throwing everything in the same bin and not thinking about it. Someone's going to come and collect it. They're going to throw it in the cart. They're going to take it away and dump it somewhere. You didn't have to think about that waste. Suddenly in the 1940s, you need to, because you're told that it's important. And so a lot of work was done trying to encourage people to separate their various bits of rubbish. And the biggest part of the system was kitchen waste. And again, lovely example of wartime propaganda here. The aim was to separate kitchen waste so that it could be turned into animal feed, usually for pigs, but sometimes also for poultry. Food waste was not initially targeted by the government. This was not seen to be particularly important in 1939, but it ended up being the largest single part of the wartime system. Collections rose from nothing, virtually nothing in 1939, to around 400,000 tonnes a year by the end of the war. And the system required an entirely new collecting and processing infrastructure. This meant bins in people's houses, collection bins, hand carts, new vehicles, sterilisers, and then the machinery to actually turn those slops, that swill, into animal feed. And it also required households to get used to using communal waste bins. So again, a big step away from the dustbin. No longer is this even getting thrown in a bin on your property. You might have to go to the end of the street to put it into a communal bin where the council are going to collect it from. And Leeds was one of the first places to start collecting kitchen waste, which we know because that early leaflet from July 1940 mentions kitchen refuse, which is a time where most councils were not doing this. And the reason Leeds was so keen to get involved is that the council already had a ready market for food waste. Since 1932, Leeds Corporation had a municipal piggery. The most famous of these was at Temple Newsam. Some of you may know the Home Farm visitor attraction. That began life as a council-run farm. It was part of a job creation scheme to help with unemployment during the Great Depression. And what had happened through the 1930s is that the pigs at Temple Newsam had been fed on waste from the nearby Seacroft Isolation Hospital. So if any of you know the big Asda on Seacroft Road, still a hospital there. That was originally an isolation hospital, so for tuberculosis victims, people who needed to be kept away from society in nice, sort of, comfortable, clean and tranquil environs. When the war started, all of the patients from Seacroft were what we would now say decanted. They were kicked out because the government worried that there were going to be so many air raid victims, they would need every hospital bed. So much like at the start of COVID, where hospital patients found themselves turfed out of hospitals to make the way for ventilators, the start of the Second World War, many patients were kicked out of these isolation hospitals to make way for potential air raid victims. The patients go, the canteen stops, you don't have the food scraps, you can't feed the pigs. So the council very quickly sees household waste as a way of plugging that gap. So beginning really early in the war, they're encouraging people to start separating kitchen waste in order that that municipal piggery can keep going. And Leeds it was one of the biggest municipal piggeries in the country. Only Birmingham had more pigs. I think there were about 350 in total. By 1941, the city had a network of 2,000 communal waste bins. And Leeds also had benefited from national investment. So the government invested in 2 new concentrator plants, and Leeds ended up turning somewhere in the region of 7,000 tonnes of food waste a year into commercial animal feed, which then went to kind of offset the rates. And we can see the impacts of this by looking at some data. And this is the kind of the most detailed slide I'm going to show you, but I think it's a really important one. And what this table shows is different types of waste. So starting with paper and card and going all the way through to kind of miscellaneous other. And we've got 2 different census points. 1938, so this is the eve of the Second World War, and then 1943, which is right in the middle of the conflict. It's the time where these schemes were really at their most kind of expansive. And we can see that food waste is the one form of waste which is dropped by the biggest number. So before the war, about 25% of the average dustbin in Leeds was made up of food scraps. 1943, that's gone down to just under 6%, which is an 18% fall. Now, when I talk in terms of percentages, what I'm not telling you is that the actual weight of that waste has also dropped dramatically. So in 1938, people were having their waste collected maybe twice a week. And by 1943, it's fortnightly dustbin collections. So I don't know exactly what the percentage was, but it's going to be quite a big fall in terms of quantity of waste. Now, those two things combined tell us that people are wasting a lot less. Of course, you're going to tell me, well, it's rationing, it's shortages, there was a war on. And of course, that is going to divert some of this waste. But what I would say in return is that because of rationing and shortages, people were growing a lot more of their food. They were buying a lot less processed food, and that actually makes a lot more waste. It's estimated from wartime figures that around 20% of all food that came into the house was wasted as inedible food. So outer leaves, peelings, stalks, shells and bones. That had to go somewhere. And what these figures suggest is that it was no longer going in the dustbin. For most people, it was going into the pig bin. It was being kept separate. And we can see the impacts of wartime recycling by looking at some of the other areas. Again, paper comes out of those figures quite heavily. Other things are sort of slightly less affected. So I think this table does show us that the war had an impact. People got used to those new routines. But I'm going to skip forward a couple of years, about 20 years actually. And I'm going to take us to the Arndale Centre in Crossgates. This is a lovely image from the late 1960s. It was taken 2 years after the centre opened. And the reason why I wanted to get Crossgates in here is that the Arndale Centre is reputedly the first covered shopping centre in Britain. So Crossgates was at the really at the sort of the forefront of a new way of living, a new type of consumerism where we can go to shops, buy pretty much anything we want, and we can take it home, we can use it, and we can throw that packaging away. And indeed, the 20 years after the Second World War were a time of considerable affluence, encapsulated by buildings like the Arndale Centre. And the history of waste in these years reflected the general trend. As people began to shop differently, the amount they threw away also increased. And there's a different type of waste going into the bins. Another thing that happens, of course, in this time is that people move away from solid fuels towards things like gas and electric central heating. So you're not getting as much ash going into these bins anyway. And there are a few precise figures to really allow me to show this. But it is estimated that immediately before the war, so around 1938, British homes were producing 10 million tonnes of rubbish per year. By the mid-1960s, that figure was around 14 million tonnes. By the end of the 1980s, it was 20 million. By the early 2000s, it was 25 million tonnes per year. And because this is no longer ash, it's things like textiles, plastic, packaging, the volume of that waste is also growing. So we're talking about something which is both heavier and, more plentiful. And in fact, in the 1960s, around the time this photograph was taken, about 90% of that waste was going to landfill. Just 3% was collected for recycling in 1964. And landfill's dominance continued right from the 1960s through to really the end of the 1990s. And this is reflected in the way that kind of Leeds had to deal with this waste, but also the technologies that are used to capture it, because suddenly one bin is not enough. Maybe households need 2 dustbins. By the time you get to the 1970s, actually the dustbin itself is too restrictive. You might need to start thinking about bin bags. And in Leeds, one of the things that happens, bringing us on to our 5th bin, is that we move gradually towards the wheeled bin, the wheelie bin. I've even heard it called the wheeler bin, which I'd not heard of before, but apparently was quite common in the late 1980s. And bins like this became a common sight in Britain from the late 1980s onwards, in part because they were able to deal with an increasing amount of waste. They're much bigger, usually 230 or 240 litre capacity. They're big. They're able to kind of deal with that new waste that's being generated. And their rise is also partly connected to a policy introduced by Margaret Thatcher in 1988. And this is why I get to talk about another module that I teach called Thatcher's Britain. My students are lucky because they hear all about compulsory competitive tendering, which was a rule which was brought in, which required councils to put certain services out for tender, and private companies could then bid in order to do those jobs more cheaply. And then the council would decide what was going to be the best use of taxpayers' money. From 1988 onwards, bin collections, refuse collection was part of that process of competitive tendering. And for many local authorities, it actually saw them move away from collecting themselves and contracting out to private collecting firms. And this is a really big shift. This is the first time that that's really happened since the 1870s. So it was a big change in policy. Leeds kept its refuse services in-house, but around 30% of councils now use that outsourced model. And bin collections were one of the most common services to be outsourced, because they are, they're pretty expensive to run. It's a universal service. People create lots of waste, and there's lots of people employed. And this is a really important part of a council's function. And why did private companies like wheelie bins? Well, they saw them as being much quicker. No longer you're going to have to pick something up, put it over your shoulder and tip it into a lorry. Instead, this is an increasingly mechanized service, one which is much easier for your collectors, but one where you can also ask residents to do part of the job for you. You can get the resident to put the bin on the curbside, and then the collector doesn't have to go into the garden and go and pick it up. So wheelie bins became part of this move towards sort of greater efficiencies, cost savings from the late 80s onwards. They also, though, coincide with some slightly broader changes to waste collection. And this is where we come back to Leeds, because as I said, Leeds kept its service in-house, but it still adopted the wheelie bin. And it was actually one of the first councils to trial wheelie bins in the early 1990s. And this is because it coincided with the rediscovery of recycling. Hence the green bins that we have in Leeds, such as this one being promoted in 2018. Because while recycling never fully disappeared in Britain, it was a marginal activity for most of the post-Second World War period. It's only really in the 1990s that this began to change. And if I was taking a top-down perspective, I'd tell you that there were various government sort of changes going on. There's the landfill tax, there's an Environment Protection Act, various things are going on at a national level. There's also international things happening, such as European regulation, but there's also a groundswell of movement happening at a local and indeed at a voluntary level, which feeds into this. And I think it's important that we don't lose sight of the fact that national policy has often followed what was happening at a local level. And Leeds is really important here. In the late 1970s, the council set up a not-for-profit company called Save Waste and Prosper, which it used the acronym SWAP. And this was set up to investigate the use of bottle and paper banks in the city. So these are the sites that you'd have in pub and supermarket car parks where you take your recycling to. And Leeds was one of the first cities to trial these when they were introduced in the late 70s. SWAP became a limited company in 1982, but continued to work closely with the council to trial new recycling schemes. And arguably the most important of these schemes came in 1990, when the city introduced an experimental curbside system called SORT, which stood for Separate Out Recyclables Today. This was a horrible acronym. This was a scheme that began in Chapel Allerton, with initially 100 willing volunteers, but it was then expanded to 4,000 households. And these households were asked to separate their dry recyclables using a green wheeled bin. And I think this is actually where the term green bin comes from. Prior to that, a lot of the curbside schemes in the UK use something called the blue box model. This gets very technical. And the blue box model is modelled on something that happened in Canada in the 1980s. Green bins, which we now kind of talk of quite ubiquitously, seem to be rooted in this scheme that took place in Chapel Allerton. And what SWAP did with the data it took from this trial is that it tried to understand what it'd be like if you extended this out across a city at large, or indeed across the country. SWAP also lobbied the government to introduce market incentives for recycling, which then paved the way for the recycling, for the landfill tax. And Leeds' pioneering scheme was steadily expanded, so that from those 4,000 in 1990, by 2003, 240,000 households in the city had access to a green bin. And that date's important because 2003 is the moment at which the government passes an act which requires all local authorities in Britain to offer a dry recycling service. So Leeds was ahead of that game, but from 2003 onwards, they didn't have a choice. You had to do it because the government told you that it was the law. And that was the first law since 1940. So it was the first time since war that councils had been told they had to collect recycling. Leeds itself completes the rollout of green bins in 2010. And some of the hardest properties to include in that system, they were flats, houses above shops, places in sort of, densely packed urban areas, or where you need communal facilities. And by 2010, Leeds was collecting around 30.4% of household waste as recycling, which was 10% lower than the national average, but was pretty good for a large city. And 2010 is quite important because from that point onwards, those figures effectively plateau. So actually, if we bring it up to date, Leeds as a city currently recycles about 38% of all of its waste, and the national figure is around 45%. So the last really 10, 15 years haven't seen as much change as the 10 or 15 preceding them. So what happens to the rest of the waste? What happens to that 60% of waste that's not being recycled? The good news is that very little of it is now buried. This is Welbeck landfill site near Normanton on the outskirts of Wakefield. And this is basically the modern version of the landfills pioneered in Bradford 100 years ago. Welbeck, like Scott Hall, is a former quarry, and it's been filled with waste from across West Yorkshire. This, at its height, was one of Europe's biggest landfills. It was filled with 560,000 tonnes of waste a year. And the rubbish here is not designed to go anywhere. Like the Bradford system, the rubbish is designed to just be protected. So it's buried in individual cells. These are lined with plastic and clay. They're topped with plastic, and then soil is put over the top of them. And the idea is that that waste will just stay there in perpetuity. It's not going to go anywhere. It's not going to cause any problems. It's not going to leach into Wortley back like was happening in Leeds in the 1930s. And this site, which began to be used by Leeds City Council in the early 2000s, is due to close later this year because not enough waste is going to it. Councils are doing something else instead. And this will become a country park, so it will be enjoyed by the people of Wakefield and West Yorkshire for years to come. What happens to most of our waste then is that it ends up at this facility if you live in Leeds, or a facility like it if you live outside the city. Because almost all non-recyclable waste in Leeds is now processed at the city's energy from waste plant at Cross Green in the east of the city. This is a timber-framed building. It was opened in April 2016, and it is effectively the high-tech version of the Meanwood Road waste destructor. This is capable of burning 214,000 tonnes of waste a year, which is basically the city's needs. The heat which is produced by this combustion is used to produce electricity, and it also provides heat energy through a system called Leeds pipes, which comes into the city centre and actually warms various buildings, including this one. Is that right? Why it's boiling. So it's our waste is keeping us warm. So this is where most of our waste now goes, and you can go on tours of this facility various times during the year. It's run as a private finance contract with Veolia, which is a big international, multinational waste contractor. But this was, this was Leeds City Council that was the driving force behind it. And I wanted to kind of bring this to a bit of an end by saying something about this continued innovation. So we've moved in this talk from the ash pit to the midden, to the movable metal dustbin, to the wartime pig bin, to the wheelie bin. And, things have changed a lot in 200 years. And even the past decade has seen various changes. People have always produced waste. They always will produce waste, but the way we deal with it has changed enormously. There is no fixed form of bin. And as we've seen in wartime, even the movable metal dustbin could be repurposed. It could be repainted and used to collect something else. And the last few years have seen even more changes, whether that be on-the-go recycling facilities, such as the yellow and very happy, smiley orange bins on the photograph, or things where we're again using technology to make this a bit easier. So in 2016, around the time the Cross Green incinerator started operating, there was a one-day collaboration between the council and a local tech company called Open Innovations. And I think somebody from that might be here today, because this led to the Leeds Bins app, which was an opportunity to bring together various forms of open data to actually make it easier for all of us to know what day to put our bins out on. And that's still important. Leeds does not have a universal collection system. In some parts of the city, black bin waste is collected every week. In other parts, it's fortnightly. Some people have brown bins for garden waste, others don't. Green bins can be collected either weekly, fortnightly, or if you're sad enough to live in Burley, every month, which is still quite shocking, I think, in 2023. So something like the Leeds Bins app tries to make that make sense, tries to help people to do the right thing. Again, it's a world away from the 7-year gap in collections in the 1830s and the boot and shoe yards, but it is part of that story of continued innovation. And of course, I've mentioned government policy at various points. I've mentioned public health acts, I've mentioned recycling acts, and the way that we recycle is undergoing currently big changes. There was recently an announcement that Leeds Green Bins are going to start accepting glass from this summer. If you didn't know that, you do now. That is or at least partly motivated by a change at a national level, a new policy which is being called simpler recycling, where all local authorities will have to collect the same dry recyclables as each other. The idea here is that it makes it easier for individuals, because if you live in York or Harrogate or Leeds, the same things are being collected, albeit potentially in different bins. But what it will mean is that packaging can be harmonized. So you can either say very simply recycle or don't recycle, rather than the current little symbol which says check local facilities. These rules will also see all households in Leeds given a food waste collection for the first time since the 1940s. That's not been confirmed yet, but the government policy is that that should be in place by March 2026. If that happens, we will be welcoming a new bin into our homes. Indeed, but I do want to conclude that by coming back to Dusty Bin. I think I should. And I think bins are important because they are a physical site where lots of different things come together. They connect our domestic habits with the environment, with public health, with government regulation, and with economic value. And they shape and are shaped by our understanding of waste. As I said throughout this talk, dustbins, they're kind of ubiquitous. Even the Leeds Bins app has a dustbin as its symbol, but they are not the only form of waste collection. They were dominant for around 100 years. To begin with, they sat alongside earlier systems like middens. Later, they were joined by separate containers for food waste. And by the mid-20th century, they were challenged by things like the bin bag and the wheelie bin. Dusty Bin was born towards the end of that period of dominance. And by the time he became a household name, actually his name was already an anachronism. Dust had already come out of those collections. And I think I've said throughout that it was not inevitable that rubbish should so closely be associated with dustbins like this. Instead, I think this tells us something about the way that we've conceived rubbish as something that needs to be cleansed, something that needs to be managed, or a resource that needs to be recovered. At different moments in time, there's been a different emphasis on those ideas. This is not a simple story of progress. There have been moments of change, there have been reverses, and there have been plenty of paths not followed. And I think that more than anything, waste is an indicator of our wider aspirations and perhaps our fears, both about society and also about the city that we live in. So thank you for listening.